Good morning. You're very welcome to today's CBI at 10 webinar. My name is Kerry Thomas. I'm one of the editors at Tortoise. Great pleasure to be doing these webinars in conjunction with the CBI. We are just 5 days away, aren't we, from a moment we've all been looking forward to with great anticipation, the lifting of what should have been, I think, the last remnants of lockdown. And I guess maybe it was inevitable that when we got to this moment, it wasn't going to be quite the thing that we imagined it would be. It wouldn't be quite a simple a joy as we probably anticipated. So in theory, we might have imagined this moment as one where our worries were going to lift. In practice, I think it feels a lot more complicated and nuanced than that. And there are things still to worry about: the infection rate, hospitalizations. And on top of that, I think one of the things we'll be talking about this morning, which is that shift in responsibility from government and the law to individuals and employers. And that's really, I think, the heart of the discussion that we're going to have over the next 45 minutes. As ever, I'm thinking we will have a lot of questions today, so please do fire them in. If you want to put them in anonymously, just write anon at the top of the question and we'll deal with that confidentially, of course. We've got some great people to put those questions to today. We've got Ray Newton-Smith, regular stalwart of these panels, CBI's chief economist. We've got Elizabeth Graves, who is an employment law partner, Elizabeth, at Eversheds. And we've got Stuart Turner, who is the director of risk and business assurance at the ENO, the English National Opera. But if we can, Ray, let's kick off with you, because 2 days now, I think, since we heard from the Prime Minister on Monday. So just remind us what exactly we heard.
Yeah, so I think, Kerry, we had it confirmed that if all goes according to plan from next Monday, we will see a huge lifting of restrictions. And it's probably worth just bearing in mind some of those ones that, so many businesses have been waiting for. It's a huge moment for wedding planners, for cafes, for bars, restaurants, theatres, sports clubs. And of course, all of us in our social lives as well. And I think the key changes really are the dropping of the 1 meter rule plus, so you don't need to have that the distance between people, which obviously I know Stuart will go on to talk about. This has a huge implications for our theatres and cafes, amongst others, and also around workspaces. Of course, it means you're able to have more people in office spaces. The rule of 6 for indoor gatherings no longer applies. That limit of 30 people for being outdoors as well is lifted. So in terms of gathering, it's sort of life back to normal. And I think importantly, people will no longer be required to work from home where it's easy to do so. And that does mean, and I think we've talked a lot on these webinars and in businesses, it felt like that working from home was a sort of forgotten army of businesses. And I certainly know that the opportunities I've had to actually meet some of my colleagues in person, after more than a year, has been so rewarding. And I think it will have a real lift both in productivity and the ability to collaborate, to be able to see people face to face. I think some of the areas that have been a bit more controversial has been around face masks and coverings. And we can see, Scotland will be following different advice than what we're seeing here, where face coverings will still be mandatory in some places. Here, it's people are being encouraged to wear face masks where there are close contact in crowded space, crowded enclosed indoor places. But it's much more up to businesses' discretion. Now, we did see the Mayor of London announce that Transport for London will be requiring face coverings. And then there was also around, what's still in place, still restrictions around quarantine from red list countries. The test and trace system is still live. But I think, in a way, it's really most restrictions have been lifted, and I think that'll be hugely significant for business. The big challenge is we're now seeing this shift onto individual responsibility by business. And I think we've seen some more guidance published today. We can maybe come on to talk about that from the government, but I think there's still a sense that there's quite a lot of grey areas, and how businesses and individuals navigate that will be tricky. And I think what we're saying is we need to see measures to boost confidence. We need to make sure businesses, individuals feel confident to re-emerge from this time of the pandemic. And it's definitely a tricky one because we're still living with the virus. There are still high infection rates. And actually, I would say the biggest business challenge many are facing at the moment is the rules around self-isolation, where we know we'll see some changes in mid-August, but it does feel like there's a big gap from now until mid-August, and it's definitely having an impact on businesses' ability to operate when we're seeing contacts of cases still having to self-isolate even when they've been double vaccinated.
I'm sure, Rain, that a lot of your members have been in touch with you since the Prime Minister's announcement, before that, of course. What have they been saying, and what's the sort of top of the list of the outstanding issues that they think need to be addressed?
I think absolutely it is this issue around self-isolation. We've had businesses say, look, in some of them, their manufacturing operations, they've had as many people, if not more people, self-isolating at the moment as they did back in January. And yet we know in terms of the pressures on hospitals, on deaths, the really horrible consequences of this disease. We're in a totally different space. So it really is this issue where they'll have the vast majority of their staff will have been double vaccinated, and yet they're being either pinged on the app or being contacted by test and trace and need to self-isolate, even though their exposure has been in circumstances where the rate of infection is likely to be very low. The risk of transmission is low, and then also we have the very successful vaccination program. So it's really becoming a business critical issue. We've absolutely seen it in schools. My daughter was off last week. It was a great moment when she got to go back again because there had been one case in her form. So I think, if we are going to live with the virus, we definitely need to update those self-isolation rules, and those are due to come in mid-August, but we'd really like that to be moved forward. And then I think just wanting more clarity on some of the guidance for businesses. We did get some more of that. There's been some, the business department published some more guidance around, what does best practice look like in ventilation. But I think businesses are encouraged by the idea of not having to enforce things like face coverings. That's been a huge issue for many businesses. Unfortunately, employees have been on the receiving end of aggressive behavior by those who don't feel they should have to wear masks. So I think not having to enforce that will be, but just knowing what the norms are in different situations and measures to really instill confidence, so people feel confident on the enablers of the economy, particularly around transportation in schools, those things that really have a knock-on implication. I think that's where they're looking for a bit more guidance, and certainly we see a role in sort of sharing some of that best practice on what different businesses are doing and how they're approaching things.
Just quick one on the self-isolation point, Ray, because I'm sure you're right, people will want to come back to that. Does it feel sustainable to remain where we are between now and mid-August, when the rules are supposed to change? Because you can already practically hear the sort of pings on people's NHS apps going off all around you, and case numbers are going to double, possibly treble, before the rules change. So that's going to multiply. That doesn't feel like something that can last, does it?
No, I personally don't think it is as sustainable, though we will see where we end up. And I think you can certainly see that the situation in schools, I don't think that would have been tenable if schools had been in over the summer. Everyone knew that, but I think schools were just saying, well, look, we just have to hang on another week, and then we're okay. But and I think that is a point. I think the government are clearly thinking, well, schools will be in. That takes away one of the issues, but I think they have to tackle this one, and we'd certainly urge the government to look at the guidance on this, because it doesn't make sense, particularly when we have the arsenal of testing available that we have. And I think that's another thing we've been asking the government, is to have more support and clarity on workplace testing. But we just need to have a test and release scheme in the same way we do for international travel. Why can't we just use the lateral flow testing system we have, and then confirmation PCR, so you have a test and release scheme for people who've been told to self-isolate?
Yeah. Okay. Rain, I think we'll come back to you. We'll come back to all of that, I'm sure. But thanks for the time being. Elizabeth, morning.
Good morning, Kerry.
Thanks for joining us. Let me sort of do the big picture thing first of all. I mentioned at the very top of the conversation that we were reading this as a moment when sort of responsibility shifts from government and the law to individuals and employers. Does that seem to you as a lawyer a fair reading of what's going on?
Yeah, I think that is a fair reading, Kerry. So from the 19th of July, employers are going to be expected to make their own informed decisions about how to manage COVID-19 risks in the workplace. Now, having said that, they all will be expected to follow the principles setting out in the working safety guidance, and Rain talked about some of the updating around air ventilation and things like that, and we're expecting that to be updated ahead of the 19th of July. So the government has indicated already that it'll set out the same familiar range of mitigations that employers need to consider for their individual workplaces, and that will include the cleaning surfaces regularly, identifying those poorly ventilated spaces, improving airflow, making sure staff and customers who are unwell don't attend the workplace, reducing unnecessary contact in the workplace where that's practical to do it, and that's where we come back into the sort of social restrictions and face covering, and of course communicating the measures to staff that the employers put in place. So, but despite the removal of the restrictions that were previously mandated, many employers will still perhaps want to follow some or all of those as part of their compliance with their general duties towards health and safety. So we've spoken already about face coverings. Those might not be mandatory, but the government has suggested that they should be considered in crowded areas. And so face coverings may be a reasonable measure for an employer to impose in certain areas of the workforce in certain circumstances. And we've got to remember as well for employers that the obligations on health and safety aren't all one-sided. There are also obligations on individual employees to take reasonable care for their own safety and others at the workplace, and to cooperate with their employer to help meet those duties. But I think what we're going to see, Kerry, is for many employers this gradual period of sort of incremental change. What the government has said is that it expects people and recommends that there is a gradual return to the workplace over the summer. And so employers are facing some really important decisions they've got to make now about who and when do they come back into the workplace. And many employers will choose to make that voluntary over the summer period, perhaps going up to September, for some maybe even as far as next year. And then they're going to have to make decisions around those social restrictions, what they'll do about face coverings in the workplace, what their stance will be on vaccination, and then, as Rain was saying earlier, how they're going to manage self-isolation when that impacts on return to the workplace.
Yeah, Elizabeth, just to pick up on one aspect of the issue you mentioned there, which let's take a poorly ventilated space in an office or a workshop or wherever. So I'm just trying to understand what the sort of status of that problem is. So it won't be the law anymore. It won't be the law that you have to ventilate that space better, but you will potentially be subject to action under health and safety legislation if an employee can claim that it wasn't properly ventilated. Is that where we're at?
I'm an employment lawyer rather than a health and safety lawyer, but the employer's duty to undertake a risk assessment will include considering things like that and what can be done. And that is clearly going to inform whether the employer chooses to bring people back into the workplace or not, because staff confidence is really, really important, and staff are entitled to know what the measures are that have been taken and consulted with recognised unions and workplace representatives on those as well. So there are going to be a lot of questions around those types of things.
Yeah, and do employers have any sort of mandatory tools or levers at their disposal? So if an employer wanted to mandate vaccines, I think that's not permissible, is it?
Look, that is a difficult question at the moment. I think that mandating vaccines for employees in the workplace will probably only be reasonable in a small range of circumstances at the moment. And we've seen the government planning to introduce mandatory vaccination in certain care settings. It's being reviewed for the healthcare sector. But for many other employers, they will need to demonstrate that if they choose to take that approach, that there are reasonable health and safety grounds that require that. And I think that's quite difficult to show, where there are a range of other mitigations that can be taken in order to demonstrate that the workplace is safe for employees. It is definitely an area that is going to change, and we're going to have to keep it under review, but I think that is the position at the current moment. Now, there are slightly lower risks for employees in making, and perhaps employers in perhaps mandating vaccination as a condition to come back into an office where an employee could alternatively work from home. So I know a number of employers are looking at things like, should we say that for this period over the next few months, you have to be double vaccinated to actually come back and work in the office. But if you're not double vaccinated, it's fine to continue working from home. And in principle, as long as an employee can work from home, that is lower risk. But if your contractual place of work is the workplace, and if, for example, there are equalities issues, discrimination here, then there may be some risk for employers even imposing that sort of lower type of measure.
Okay, and finally, just before I come to Stuart, what's the status of an employer's right to know whether an employee has been double vaccinated or not? Can an employee simply refuse to say?
So your vaccination status is special category data, which is subject to additional controls under data privacy legislation. So I think it is difficult for employers outside those narrow sorts of circumstances I've talked about to compel employees to share their vaccination status. They'll need to have a health and safety grounds or public health grounds on which they can do that. And there are a range of data privacy obligations that will then apply to, if you do ask employees to show you that data, what you actually do with it. And helpfully, the ICO has published some updated guidance this week on use of the NHS Act, for example, and the difference between employers taking a look on somebody's mobile phone at what that vaccination status is, and then actually alternatively scanning it, which is processing or keeping a record of it. So employers who are choosing to ask about vaccination status will need to get up to speed with that and have procedures around it. What I have seen employers doing is asking employees if they would like to volunteer that data, even if it's voluntary. It's still special category data, and so they need to be very careful that that is truly anonymous if that's what they're doing.
Okay, fascinating. Thanks, Liz. We will come back to you as well. Stuart, good morning. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning.
You, I guess, at the ENO, you're one of the organisations that has been looking forward to the easing of all lockdown measures as much as anybody out there, haven't you? And so just talk us through how you've thought about this moment when you've planned for this full reopening.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a long time in the coming, Kerry. It's so I mean, we thought through as the pandemic's gone on, many different iterations of how we might open, what it might look like, and it's finally arrived now. I think in the early days we tried, like many employers, to rewrite or write a new book. Nobody had quite written the book yet for pandemic, and we were trying to get ahead of the curve and write a lot of things. And early on, it became apparent to us that health and safety systems and processes that we already have in place actually could be adapted and should be adapted to incorporate how we approach health and safety within the theatre. So it was just you were basically adding it in as another risk. But I think the other thing was we also spent a lot of time talking to staff, talking to customers, openness, honesty and transparency about how we could get people back into a theatre in a safe way, speaking to local health authorities, speaking to public health teams about requirements when we brought people back into the building. So yeah, it's been a long journey and there's been many different iterations of it, but we've finally arrived.
Actually, we take staff and audiences as sort of two interesting and different categories. So from the staff point of view, what's the sort of mood as Monday approaches? Because you're going to be fully open, every seat taken. It should feel like the old days, shouldn't it? How are staff feeling? What's been the conversation with them about that prospect?
I think it's really mixed. It's really mixed. I think across probably not just the theatre performing arts sector. I think across all sectors. There is different risk appetite. people's anxieties are in different places for a variety of reasons. So we've got some members of staff that are quite happy and would like to be back to normal immediately. There are other members of staff that are far more cautious. So we've spent a lot of time talking to different people and thinking about the approaches we might take and the systems and processes we might put in place to keep them safe in the workplace, but also make them feel safe in the workplace. And there are important distinctions as well, you know, just making people feel happy that they're in the workplace, remembering that many of the staff haven't been back to work or in crowded spaces like many of us for a long time. And those anxieties are very, very real, and we're really acutely aware of them and how we approach it. But it's very much about communication. We need to keep those communication lines open, and sometimes that brings some inherent problems of feeling like we're flip-flopping around in policy, trying to bed things in. But as long as we communicate that with them, it's been well received so far.
And among your staff, Stuart, do you have any idea who's vaccinated and who's not?
People do bring it up. Yes, yeah. So we're working through those at the moment. There are some areas where close contact work is inevitable. So we're kind of working our way through that. The same with testing, where we're not able to socially distance them, specifically in the performance space. You know, we have to make sure we've got robust mitigations in place. So yeah, we're working our way through all those.
And just to pick up on the point that Rain was talking about earlier on, the problems that employers are experiencing right now with you know, the amount of people whose NHS apps are pinging them and the amount of self-isolation that's being imposed, is that causing you difficulties?
Oh, absolutely. And I think the whole industry, I mean, ourselves, but yeah, I mean, it's definitely a problem. The close contact pings are the real issue for us. I think everybody accepts that, you know, if you're poorly or if somebody in your household is poorly with COVID, then absolutely people should be self-isolating. But I think with the number of cases that we have now and the amount of apps pings that are happening and self-isolation that's required, it's making it almost impossible to carry on just because of the sheer number that's happening. And we're hearing this not just for ourselves, but across the sector. It's becoming a real challenge how we will keep theatre going with these measures in place.
I just want to pick up with you, Stuart, on a question that's come in from Michael Hurst, this is a sort of general point, but I think it's particular to you as well. He says the lifting restrictions and boosting confidence can be double-edged. Some customers want assurance about safety, but doing away with safety measures such as social distancing and masks could run counter to that. How are you finding the balance between the sort of the people who want to get back and embrace life as normal and those who are nervous and want the protections and even the distancing still in place?
Yeah, it's a real challenge. I mean, we looked abroad and spoke to Sydney quite early on because Sydney lifted restrictions. They've obviously reimposed things with things that have happened there, but we looked at some learning there, and they found it a real problem. And I think as we go forward into this next phase, it will become a problem in managing that conflict. Not, you know, there are a lot of people that are quite happy and have had enough and are fed up and want to move on. But there are others that aren't. So we're looking at different options of how we might approach it. We've probably not come up with all the solutions yet, and I think this is going to be an evolving thing as we move forward. But we've definitely got to keep an eye on those who are more risk averse, because what we don't want to do from an employee point of view is create a two-tier workplace. And equally, we want to make sure that customers that come to the theatre come confidently and they feel safe. So a bit of a minefield, Kerry, but we're working our way through.
Yeah, okay. Well, I think we'll probably get a few questions in on that as well. So stand by, Stuart. I've got a couple already for you, Elizabeth, if I may. A handful have come in from people who own bars and nightclubs. Particularly this question of badly ventilated space and how you do a risk assessment for your workforce when you're bringing a large group of people into a space that probably hasn't been built or designed to be well ventilated. It's a nightclub, it's a box. How what are the duties on an employer then to do? How does an employer do a risk assessment for that space when they don't know who's coming, they don't know who's vaccinated, they don't know what they're bringing in? How do you do a sensible assessment in that kind of environment?
And I mentioned, Kerry, I'm an employment lawyer rather than a health and safety lawyer, but so this isn't my particular area of expertise. But I do think that those with those sorts of individual work circumstances are going to have to take quite a tailored approach to this, and it's going to be important to see how the industry responds. But they are going to be thinking about some of the other measures that I've talked about that might be available in some of the range of circumstances. So there may be legitimate grounds, for example, to ask about vaccination status, or to use even though the government has declined to go forward with COVID status certification at the moment, but to think about how that COVID pass data might be useful to them. So I think there are a particular set of circumstances there for that hospitality industry, and it will be, as we talked earlier about, the government is looking at mandating vaccination in the care sector, reviewing the healthcare sector. The next place to look might well be in the hospitality sector because of these types of risks and issues.
Yeah, okay. We had another question which is part health and safety and part employment. So I'm grateful for your help, even though this might be slightly outside your brief. If there is a situation where a staff member or customer caught COVID in a workplace, could employers then face a legal challenge?
Yes, potentially, I think, but it'll be very difficult to actually prove that COVID was contracted in the workplace, particularly at the moment where it's circulating so widely in society. But an employer who hasn't, for example, acted on the measures that they've decided to take in their own risk assessment, or hasn't done a proper risk assessment, is going to be exposed in those circumstances. And there is also potentially individual employee exposure for the reasons I spoke about earlier. Individual employees have their own responsibilities to comply with the procedures that the employer puts in place for the health and safety of others as well as themselves.
Okay. Ray, let me come back to you, because you mentioned when we were talking at the top of this conversation that there'd been more guidance published today, and I didn't actually ask you what exactly was out there. So can you just bring us up to date with what we've heard today?
Yes, well, I think it's due. I'm going to tread a little bit carefully because I think it's due to be published today. But I think what we're expecting to see is more, a bit more clarity on some of this workplace guidance, and I think it will stay in that realm of guidance as well. And I think some of that will be welcome. It won't give as much clarity as we would like, and I think some of the areas it will be looking at is around, so when you're at a venue, do you need to check in, do you need to get people's contact details? And our understanding is we're going to move away from it being mandated that you need to check in at a venue, but I think what will be encouraged is actually it's helpful if you encourage your customers to check in via the app, because therefore that makes it easier for the NHS test and trace system to work well. So I think that will be some welcome clarity. I think there will be some more, and I think what we've been asking for is in terms of the health and safety executive. I mean, businesses are not, we're not scientists. Obviously, there are some businesses where scientists are employed, but most businesses are not scientific experts. So that's where the health and safety executive is useful in providing guidance. So I think we will see some of that, the basic guidance around ensuring well ventilated places, ensuring hand washing. I think some of those basic measures which we know do help to keep infection rates down will be there. But I think I think some of the areas where we still need to see more clarity, as we've discussed already, is self-isolation. And I guess just to clarify some of that earlier point, I think when it comes to the app, that the idea to self-isolate is advisory. It's not a legal requirement. The legal requirement comes from when you are contacted by NHS test and trace directly. And so I think that does mean that businesses can use workplace testing. They can use other things for people to restore confidence where, because obviously the challenge around the app is the accuracy, right? Or you may have been I remember very early on, I don't know whether this actually happened, but very early on in the pandemic, there were concerns that if you had a bus stop outside of your workplace and people were waiting for a bus who may not have even been associated with your workplace, they, people inside the workplace might have been pinged by the app.
Yeah, and Rain, because Elizabeth mentioned COVID status certificates, which I think for the moment the government has decided not to mandate. Where's that conversation at? Is that possibility still alive, or do you regard that now as something we've moved beyond, the idea of COVID status certificates?
I mean, our understanding is that won't be at one point when they were doing the reviews, there was the idea for live events that would be something that all live events would need to follow a sort of similar to what they did in the Euros, right? You had to either be show proof that you were double vaccinated, or you had to show your vaccination status, or show that you had a negative test before going into those venues. But I think they've moved away from that, having that sort of mandated approach. But as Elizabeth was saying, that doesn't mean that individual businesses can decide carefully to sort of use that sort of approach if they wanted to, if they want to restore, to ensure confidence at their venues. But I think, to be honest, as we know, that is really, it's quite difficult. It's a huge undertaking. And I think that's where the focus has got to be on getting as many people vaccinated as possible, having a regular regime of easy access to testing, companies being able to access workplace testing, rather than having individual businesses having to put together a program which is very difficult to do, particularly on a regular basis.
And just on that issue of workplace testing, Rain, we've had a question about whether the free government lateral flow tests are coming to an end. Is that the case, or what? And also asking whether the CBI is worried that there might be an issue with supply of lateral flow testing.
So I haven't come across any issues around supply of lateral flow testing, but obviously interested to hear if anyone is having challenges getting the test. Certainly, as an individual citizen, I've been amazed that you ask for your test and they arrive sort of next day by your postman. It's quite amazing, and postwomen. But I think our real concern is we would like to see the support for workplace testing continue beyond July, particularly when we have the infection rates where we are, and that is one of our core asks to government. I think it's really important for that confidence for businesses, and so much of this is about restoring confidence. Yes, we've got systems in place to deal with this. Yes, infection rates are going up, but hospitalizations are very low, and importantly, we have measures in place to contain those infections and the risks of those infections to others. And that's why we think it's important that workplace testing is widely available to those who need beyond the end of July.
Okay, Elizabeth, I've got a quick question to you, then I'm going to come back to Stuart. This one comes from Russell Cash, who's asking whether he obviously works for a company that operates across multiple sites, and says, I assume it is perfectly acceptable to have differing policies at different sites rather than one policy for the entire population.
Yeah, it is, and in fact the risk assessment should be done to that for that particular workplace, but a number of employers will have a broader policy that sits above it. So for example, I think in theory you could have an organisation-wide stance on social distancing or face coverings, but then do something specific based on a risk assessment at a particular site.
Yeah, okay. Stuart, I just wanted to come back to you to pick up on something you were talking about earlier on. I mean, we were talking about your audiences and their risk appetites and their confidence levels. And that's obviously going to be a critical thing for all kinds of businesses, particularly in hospitality, but actually across the range, I suspect, retail and, other businesses as well. So just tell us how you've gone about building confidence and communicating with your audiences so that they do come back with full knowledge of what they're going to find and not surprised, I suppose.
Yeah, so very early on we did some test events when restrictions were first lifted. So we run a test event looking at all the systems and processes we put in place. The government run a number of trial events across the UK in various venues that we also looked at to make sure we were putting the right processes in place as well. And then it was a case of sort of polling audiences once they had been and trying to get, and we sent a poll out to people just to ask how they felt, and generally it was all very well received. with all the controls that were in place. But there was lots of things that we picked up through those polls that we could put in place. I think it was also different perceptions as well, and where with audiences coming in, we've got on the same event, some people saying they were really, really happy, other people saying, oh, well, we thought we could do better. But it's important that we've just had that open, transparent dialogue with people. And that's been the important piece for us to be able to then build, and it's that sort of continuous improvement moving forward. So it's just maintaining dialogue with the audiences in the best way possible.
And has that given you any insight into what the balance is between, you know, we talked before about people who have a sort of relatively high appetite for risk and those who are very risk averse? Have you got any sort of readout on how those two things net out?
Yeah, I think it's very split. It's very split down the middle. I mean, I think it moves around, certainly with the infection rates now so high and concerns. I think people become more risk averse. But certainly, you know, we talked about 58, 48, 52 split, which just sort of seems to happen everywhere. But that's pretty similar where we're at the moment.
Okay, I guess sort of staying with that sort of theme, but thinking about workforce rather than customers, can I come back to you, Rain? Because Elizabeth was saying before that she expects probably things to go gradually, that Monday won't be a big bang, that people will, for legal reasons, but for concern of how their staff will react as well, that probably this is going to be quite a lengthy process. Is that how you at the CBI see things changing from Monday?
Yeah, I think, you know, I think for most businesses, they're seeing a gradual evolution of the rules they've had in place over the course of the summer and into the autumn. And I think the return to offices is a very good example of that. I think we're still in that period where businesses are consulting with their staff. They're gradually bringing people back. But allowing a lot of employee choice within that, and also thinking very much around hybrid meetings, how will they work, and using some of the summer months to really sort of test that out. So I think it's a sort of smooth transition for many businesses. Of course, what is really important is for those businesses who haven't been able to open, this is a big moment for them, and they've been planning for this to happen for a long time. So they've been planning what sort of measures will they have in place within their businesses to open safely. So I don't think it will feel like a dramatic overnight life goes from life living with the virus to suddenly this is life returning to normal to where we were pre-pandemic. I think it's going to be a gradual evolution, both in terms of how customers feel, but how the measures that businesses are putting in place. But I think one of the things that certainly comes from, I think, being in workplace, the more that people do new activities that they haven't done for a while, the more confident they feel. You sort of go, you do that, and you realize actually this does feel quite safe. And I think that's one of the things, is it will be a gradual return to individual confidence. Once you start doing new activities, you remember how much you enjoy doing these things, like going to the gym, going to the theater, all of the, there are huge rewards. And I think that's one of the mind shifts we have to think about, is not just thinking about some of the risks. There are risks, every day throughout the course of our lives, but also, thinking about the benefits we get from the enrichment of our lives through theatre, through being able to travel, being able to see friends, being able to do some of the things that we've been missing over the past few months.
And Elizabeth, well, I guess Rain is talking about employee choice there, and people might want to, might want to re-engage, might want to enjoy themselves and get back to normal again, if we can remember what that was. One of the sort of, I guess traditionally the sort of counterbalance would have been business need and employee choice. And how big and different a challenge to an argument about business need, about getting people back to something like COVID represent, when we're not talking about a marginal thing, we're talking about something that an employee might say could be a risk to life.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are questions of what the legal position is. There are questions about what you need to do to build confidence, regardless of the legal position. And then there are those specific risk issues as well. So, the answer to the question, can an employer require all its employees to come back into the workplace, as of Monday, is that even though people have been working from home or out of the workplace for quite a long time, that has been temporary. And in most individuals' employment contracts, it will say that that workplace is their contractual place of work. So the general legal position from a business need perspective is that employers have always been able to recall those employees to that workplace, subject to the government restrictions that are in place and which are lifting as of Monday on where people work, and to their health and safety duties. That there will be special considerations for particular individual employees, like those with underlying health conditions, those who fall within the extremely clinically vulnerable category. And I think guidance was published yesterday, I believe, on what the steps are that those individuals can take to keep themselves safe, and encouraging them to have a dialogue with their employer about the measures that are being taken in the workplace. So those are the needs that have to be balanced. But I think going back to that question of, does everybody come back on Monday versus the gradual return, if you want to build confidence of staff, that engagement with them, understanding what their concerns are, going out with your surveys to ask how you feel about some of these particular topics and what's worrying you is going to be really, really important in balancing the needs and hopefully meeting a compromise somewhere.
And as a lawyer, Elizabeth, do you look around and think that we've probably got precedent and case law that's going to cover this, or are we about to engage in a sort of large-scale writing of employment law, do you think, through this?
It's been an incredible time to be an employment lawyer since last February, March. We watched this developing over in China from December 2019 to where we are now, and there have been huge, very swift changes in employment law over this last 16-month period. And we are starting to see case law having come through the employment tribunals on issues like, when has an employee been subjected to a detriment or dismissed because they raised a reasonable belief that returning to the workplace would put them in imminent danger. And because those are still early cases, they're quite divergent and it's difficult to extract themes from them, but we're going to see more and more clarity around those old and established, legal principles being applied to this new disease.
Okay, Stuart, we've just got a couple of minutes left. I'd like to, I think so many of us are hoping that places like the ENO will be back open again and we can start going out and enjoying ourselves. Give us a kind of optimistic readout about what the next few months might look like if you get the right sort of help from government, the right sort of guidance, if you can communicate in the right way with your audiences. What's your sort of optimistic scenario for where we might be by September, maybe?
Oh gosh, huge question. I'm optimistic. I mean, I'm positive. I think things are moving in the right direction. I think, as someone alluded to earlier, once people start doing things that they haven't done for a long time and their risk appetite sort of grows, I think we'll be in a better place. There is huge uptake for tickets and things. People want to come back to the West End. People want to come back to theatre. It's sort of predicated on looking at that data that we've all got so used to looking at, cases rising, and that fear factor. But I do think that as people drift back, confidence will rise. It's really incumbent on us to make sure they feel comfortable coming back into them spaces and that we reintroduce things slowly. I think just going back onto the workplace piece, we're very much about the hybrid working. We've learned a lot of things that we can take forward, even in our sector where it's very much about being in the building. A lot of the stuff that we can do can be done in a hybrid way and can be done working remotely. And we're not about to throw that under the bus now. That was some really good working practices that we can take away. So, yeah, I'm cautiously optimistic, but I think we've got a few lumps along the road to go.
Thank you, Stuart. Thank you, Elizabeth. We've just we're out of time, really, but I'll just I'll steal a few seconds for people today. It's hard to listen to a conversation like this without thinking that in the end, communication is just the key, isn't it? That actually communicating with staff, communicating with customers, communicating with audiences, that's going to be the difference between succeeding and failing for a lot of companies, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's about building the trust with your customers, the trust with your employees, and that's all about clearly communicating. And it's great. I think we will see more guidance from Bay's business department around different workplace settings. And I think really just to finish where Stuart also ended up, I think really encouraging what we have seen is when venues have opened up, we've seen customers have come. We can see that across the economy, and it's part of the reason why our economy is recovering. And I think if we do this well and manage it well, then we'll see that confidence return. We'll continue to see strong economic growth, and I think that very gradual return to a new normal of life for all of us.
Okay. Rain, thank you. Elizabeth, Stuart, you've been brilliant. Thank you both so much for joining us. The next webinar, next CBI at 10, is next Monday, where we're going to be looking at economic forecast for the recovery and latest projections for growth and all that kind of macroeconomic stuff. So do join us then. But until then, have a great weekend or have a great end of the week, and we will see you soon.